thank you for joining the session today on Project Pothole. This will focus primarily on our Adept Live Labs 2 project up here in Scotland, the Centre of Excellence for Decarbonising Roads. Now, I'm sure no one in this room or this conference centre is a stranger to potholes. Top of most politicians' hit list, they seem to be one area that gets the most focus of our wide and varied highways and local road surfaces. They cause accidents, damage to road user injuries, damages to vehicles, claims, public complaints, and many, many hours of blood, sweat, and tears to try to repair them. So there's a lot that goes into them, but not as much from a carbon perspective. So it should be no sort of surprise that the Centre of Excellence focused our sights very first and foremost on this part of our highways services. And today, as an update to our self-proclaimed Project Pothole, I'm going to briefly just recap for those who are unfamiliar what the Live Labs 2 programme is and what the Centre of Excellence is and how that fits within it. Then go into Project Pothole, first of all, our design and delivery of the trials, and then what we've started to gather from our initial evaluation and insights. And then finally, I'll talk through what this means from a decarbonisation perspective and what's next for the Centre and Live Labs 2 more generally. So for those who haven't heard of Live Labs 2, our various different presentations. It's a £30 million 3-year programme funded by the Department for Transport. It's focused entirely on decarbonising local roads and has a laser-sharp focus on carbon reduction. This is separated into 4 main themes, which I'll go on to in a minute, and that's separated as well then into 7 interconnected projects. And there's local authority-led projects, but supported by commercial and academic partners. We have kicked off in April 23, or May 23, and we're running until the end of April 26, but we're benefiting from a great long 5-year monitoring and evaluation period, so then we can demonstrate the benefits, impacts, and learnings long-term to the sector. So as I mentioned, it's 4 main themes. I won't spend too much time on this, but it's focused on green carbon laboratories, so looking at verge maintenance and creating a more circular approach through pyrolysis and biochar, corridors and places, so net zero corridors, street lighting, and then finally us, the Centre of Excellence. We are led by North Lanarkshire Council up here in Scotland, and then down south, our partners, Transport for West Midlands. We're also supported by our commercial partners, so myself, Amey at Amey, and then Colas as well, supporting Transport for West Midlands. So why the Centre of Excellence? As we were going through this bidding stage, we decided that there was a lot of wealth of best practice out there that was waiting to be untapped. We're not a sector notoriously good at addressing siloed working. We're short on time, and often that we face issues with finding the time for collaboration and sharing all that best practice that we have. The materials that we work with are intensively carbon intensive, whether it be asphaltic solutions, concrete, and the materials market itself is saturated. Each different supplier is on its own journey. Each supplier has its own carbon savings claims, and it's hard to make sense from a local authority perspective of what's true and what may be greenwash. And then equally, we all have impending net zero targets. This is something that should all be top of our agenda. It's easy to push to a tomorrow problem, but something we're starting to see the effects of right now, as we have done with the recent sort of severe weather events. So the Centre represents an opportunity or an environment to try to bring all of this best practice together, to bring the sector, both public, private, academic, to address decarbonising road materials. We're looking at creating a knowledge bank as well, so that we can host and share all that information. So the Live Labs 2 project has really focused and adopted an innovation management approach. So this is adapted from Live Labs 1, but it starts first with discovery, looking at challenges to decarbonisation, then through identification, so looking at what's the very best in the sector, both domestically but also internationally. We then pre-qualify those materials through a scorecard, looking at okay, what works from a carbon perspective, but what may have challenges from an operational perspective or procurement or cost. And then we do our live trials, and that's been ongoing in North Lanarkshire. I'm here to talk about potholes, but we've also looked at a number of different material categories, line marking, surface treatments, and we're moving to surfacing in the coming summer. We then do full technical carbon and scalability evaluations, and really crucially, the last step in that puzzle, and one of the most challenging, is the scaling question. So how do we embed this as business as usual? First of all, in North Lanarkshire, the West Midlands, but really what we want to do is spread the word across UK local authorities and empower them to have all the information they need to start to adopt these materials. So as I mentioned, one of the ways we're doing that is through the development of an online knowledge bank, which will be launched in 2025. So why potholes? As discussed earlier, we spend an inordinate amount of time on potholes. It's something that there's lots of claims for carbon savings, but not really much clarity. It's one of our core service activities, but it's seen very little from a carbon perspective due to its inherent complexity. Not every defect is the same. The amount of material you need to use, the transport to and from various defects to repair them are not created equally, and the longevity of those repairs are also based on a million different variables. So how do we make sense of that in a way that local authorities have the confidence to decarbonise? It's not all hopeless. There is hope. It is a low-risk route to decarbonisation. So unlike incorporating maybe more biogenic binders that require, quite a big and upfront investment and then a high risk of for failure, if a pothole repair defect fails due to a new material, it's relatively easy to remedy that. So there's opportunities there to decarbonise today, and that's looking at increasing the use of our reclaimed asphalt pavement, or RAP, sustainable additives, cold mix solutions, and longer lasting repairs, so that whole life cycle of the asset. So as I mentioned, Project Pothole was our first focus. In North Lanarkshire, we looked specifically at trying to represent the different road types. So we did 6 total sites across North Lanarkshire, and that's a map for those who are unfamiliar. And that's across 2 A sites, 2 B sites, and 2 C sites. We wanted to see how these repairs worked from both on different road types in terms of traffic loading, etc., both from a technical perspective and a carbon perspective. The materials we trialled, we'll be releasing that in full on our knowledge bank, so calling out specific suppliers and making sure that we verify all of our findings with them. But it was 2 MMA-based materials, or sort of claiming to be permanent pothole repair materials, 1 mastic asphalt made with end-of-life waste tyres, and then 1 cold mix with reclaimed RAP and biobinders. As I mentioned, that was across A, B, and C sites back in February and March of this year. And it involved the creation of 18 simulated potholes and patches. So we recognized, talking with our academic partners, with our technical lead, that there are so many different underlying reasons for a defect to occur. So how do we accurately compare the performance of one material against another if we're looking at completely different environments? So to try to literally even the playing field, we created the simulated potholes on amber-rated, quite lovely roads, and 2 meters apart each, standard sizes, so that same weather, same sort of operational teams, same conditions of laying, so that we can compare from a technical perspective when they start to fail, but also we can compare from a carbon perspective exactly how much waste was used, exactly how much material, exactly how much fuel, and then start to develop those profiles out for a standard pothole. We also looked at controls and benchmarks. So locally in North Lanarkshire, it's a standard cold mix repair material, and then HRA as well as a more wider sector standard. And those were also included and trialled alongside the 4 different materials. We also benefited in this environment from getting the operative feedback, so actually talking to the people who lay these materials day in, day out, to understand, okay, well, how is this going to work for you? Are there barriers, skills you would need to learn, or health and safety considerations that you're worried about when laying this in comparison to what you do normally. And we're recording that and including that in all of our findings. We also collected a lot of contextual data, understanding from a coring perspective what the actual sort of makeup of the pavement of the sites that we trialed on were, from a technical perspective, and then cost as well, looking at the whole costs for those pothole repairs. In terms of what's coming next, we're looking at developing carbon profiles for those materials, which I'll go on to in a bit of detail, and that's coming to a close now. And then also looking at how we start to spread the word and transition. Down south in the West Midlands, they also followed a similar set of trials, but looking at more of an operational perspective. So how are these materials going to work on actual potholes? Yes, we've created this quote-unquote clean environment in North Lanarkshire, but we also need to understand how it's going to work in the real world. So those findings are being incorporated into ours. As I mentioned, carbon is key to us, and in terms of how we evaluate these materials. We are a low carbon or decarbonisation program, but we also know that in order for any of this to work, it needs to make sense from a technical longevity perspective and an operational perspective. So from the technical side, we're working with the University of Nottingham and Aston University to do pothole slabs. So creating slabs of the different materials and then doing accelerated life testing to understand the point of failure and any longevity implications of that. From an operational perspective, gathering that feedback I mentioned, the contextual data, photography, videography, so local authorities can feel comfortable to say, no, I recognize that, or that, that doesn't look so scary, this new low carbon material. And then from a carbon perspective, working with the Future Highways Research Group to develop verified carbon profiles for each material, working through the whole life cycle. So looking at more specifically at the carbon side of things, there's, surprise, surprise, not unlike pothole repair itself, a lot of complexity, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We've looked at first collection of on-site operational data, as I mentioned, fuel, waste, staff, everything that goes alongside that. The embodied carbon data, and I'll go on in a second to talk about some of those challenges. Longevity testing, so as I mentioned, the slabs testing with Nottingham and Aston to understand that estimated whole life. So something may be inherently low carbon in the embodied side of things, but the defect or the repair may fail after a year or 2 years, whereas something that may last 5 years but have higher upfront embodied carbon may actually be the lowest carbon option. So we're looking at that and how we present that to the sector. As I mentioned, we've also been creating full carbon profiles with our partners, and then verifying our numbers across both the West Midlands and North Lanarkshire Council. Now, I've anonymised some of these findings, but that's just a snapshot of some of our carbon profiles, looking at the 6 different materials. As you can see, some of the biggest heat spots for us were the materials that involve waste. So again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. If you plan out your works accordingly in such a way that the materials that create waste that can't be recycled are fully utilized based on their unit that they're sold in, then great. Then that takes that waste right down. And then it's the embodied carbon as well. But again, also looking at transport, etc. So as I mentioned, pothole decarbonisation is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's sort of a linear or a stepped approach to decarbonisation. Number one, we have to first look at reduction. So before we're even getting to the stage of potholes, what can we do to reduce the formation of these defects in the first place? I know, again, this is something that we're all aiming towards. We don't want to be dealing with potholes day in, day out, even though it's somewhat unavoidable. But looking at preventative maintenance. So as I mentioned, we're looking at surface treatments as well. But this is one of those methods that can try to extend the asset life in the first place. Then secondly, looking at transport carbon, something that is sort of out of scope for us as we're looking more specifically at materials, but optimization of routes, making sure that we're reducing the amount of transport carbon that we're creating through our pothole shifts. Then reducing the material usage and waste in the first place. There are many sort of thermal repair methods or methods that reduce the amount of material you actually need in order to repair the defects. So that's something that reduces that need in the first place. And then finally, once you're starting to look at the materials and you've answered those questions, then it's looking at longer lasting repairs. What materials maybe have higher upfront cost, higher upfront carbon, but are going to last longer and save you more headaches in the future. Preventing water ingress, or maybe looking at MMA products. And also then transitioning to cold mix and materials with wrap and biogenic binders. So it won't come sort of as a surprise, but there are lots of challenges in the carbon world that we're facing as we've gone through this process, and lots that we're trying to address for the benefit of the sector. One of them being in terms of emissions factors. Each supplier is on a different journey in terms of their maturity with carbon data. Some have third-party verified EPDs, which is what we should be aiming for. Some are still unsure of where the carbon intensity is in their manufacturing process. There are cost barriers to this as well for a lot of suppliers. So how do we better support that? We are working with the University of Nottingham to develop an NDA process where they walk suppliers through sort of what goes into their carbon emissions, and then we use that factor if they don't have a third-party verified EPD. We're also keeping emissions up to date, or trying to as much as we can, but this is constantly moving. If you look at anything bituminous, for example, month to month, it could be drastically changing where that supply is coming from. So how do we accurately then make decisions to decarbonise, or what material is lower carbon than another material, if we don't know month in, month out where it's sitting? We're trying as much as possible to engage with key sector bodies to incorporate those updates. For example, the new Euro bitumen emissions factors launching soon. But again, this is a challenging area, and it's more around that data updates as well, and how we automate that. And then finally, as I mentioned, longevity, kind of the elephant in the room. One of the things we often hear as well, I'm not really going to trust that unless I've seen it on the road for 20 years. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time for that. We don't have time anymore to wait 20 years, because in 20 years, we have climate crises already ruining our roads. So we need to start to work towards a level of confidence and an acceptance of risk to choose lower carbon options. As I mentioned, we're working with Nottingham to try to at least have lab testing to support that. We're working with our live trial results so that we can have indicative whole life performance. But again, this is something that we as a sector need to come together and start to gain a bit of confidence and a bit of bravery in that space. So what's next for us? We have more busy periods until the end of our programme in April 26. So I mentioned the longevity testing and the slabs is ongoing with the University of Nottingham, or about to kick off. We're also looking at a possible phase 2. So in our first set of trials, we looked really more at the sort of emergency pothole size, and that type of defect. But we're looking at larger defects, maybe patching works, cracking, ironworks reinstatement, and maybe expanding sort of how the materials perform in those settings. And then looking at additional materials. So if there are suppliers, both that you're aware of, or if you're a supplier yourself, that you feel you can get involved in this project, speak to us now, because we're starting the planning process now. And we're also hoping to develop a carbon treatment matrix. So looking at your defect size, your road type, and what that involves, what should be your recommended lowest carbon sort of solution generically based on that. And then we're also continuing trials and technical and carbon evaluations. As I mentioned, we're not just a pothole project, although some people have started to call me Miss Pothole, but we are looking at surfacing trials back in 25. We've already carried out trials of line marking, adopting the similar side-by-side approach, and we've also looked at surface treatments and looking at some signage materials as well upcoming, and footways and cycleways. So we're trying to represent the whole picture of decarbonisation, but I'm glad that we've first and foremost focused on one of our biggest pain points as a sector, which is potholes. We're keen very much to have people involved. So please do get in touch. We have a QR code that takes you to our website. We've got forms you can fill out, but we're looking for local authorities to become part of our journey, to share their challenges, their material case studies, and to fill out our forms, and then get first access to a knowledge bank when that's launched. And then also looking for suppliers, get involved, fill out the form, and you can be considered for live trials as part of our program.